Welcome to Dark Hour Tales. Tonight's tale is The Thing Outside. At 2:13 in the morning, Daniel Mercer woke because Molly was growling beside the bed, although she was not barking, pacing, or making the impatient noise she used when she wanted to be let outside. Instead, she was producing the low, continuous growl Daniel had heard only a handful of times in the years he had owned her, usually when a stranger approached the house after dark. He opened his eyes slowly, still trying to understand what had disturbed her, and realized that Molly was standing rigidly beside the window with her head lowered and every part of her attention fixed on the curtains. Daniel pushed himself upright and quietly called Molly towards him, but she ignored him and continued staring at the window. Before he could call her again, the security light mounted outside the bedroom snapped on, and weak white light spilled around the edges of the curtains, although something interrupted that light almost immediately. A dark shape appeared against the fabric, broad enough at the shoulders to resemble a person standing directly outside, and for several seconds Daniel simply stared because his mind was still trying to process the scene as though it were ordinary. Someone had apparently come onto the property and was standing close enough to block the security light, which would have been frightening enough by itself, but the explanation stopped making sense as soon as Daniel remembered where he was. His bedroom was on the second floor, and there was no balcony, roof extension, or ladder outside the window that could possibly support somebody at that height. Molly's growl deepened, while the shadow remained motionless against the curtain, and Daniel reached for the heavy torch he kept beside the bed before moving carefully towards the glass. He resisted switching on the main bedroom light because he did not want to advertise exactly where he was standing, yet the silhouette did not shift as he approached. There was no scraping against brickwork, and no movement outside that suggested somebody was climbing, while the complete stillness of the shape made it feel less like a person balancing outside and more like something that had simply been placed there. Daniel stopped a few feet from the curtains, listened for several seconds, and eventually took hold of the fabric before pulling it aside while raising the torch towards the window. There was nothing outside the glass. The security light illuminated the wall, the narrow strip of ground below, and part of the garden, but Daniel could see no person and no obvious way anyone could have reached the second floor. He checked the upper frame for marks before looking down at Molly, who had backed several steps away without relaxing and continued staring beyond the window as though whatever had frightened her had simply moved somewhere else. Daniel followed her gaze towards the field behind the house. His property stood alone at the end of a narrow country road, surrounded on three sides by farmland and separated from the nearest neighbouring house by almost half a mile. He had lived there for 6 years and knew the shapes of the hedges, trees, and fence lines, even in poor light, which was why the figure standing at the far edge of the field immediately seemed unfamiliar. At first, Daniel thought he was looking at a fence post, or perhaps somebody walking across the land without permission, but the proportions became increasingly difficult to interpret once he concentrated on them. The figure stood beside fencing he knew reached roughly to his waist, yet whatever was beyond it rose more than twice as high. Its body appeared extremely narrow, with arms hanging slightly lower than seemed natural, and a head that looked too long from crown to chin, while the entire figure remained completely motionless and faced directly towards the house. Daniel aimed the torch through the window, but the beam lost most of its strength before reaching the far side of the field. He picked up his phone and opened the camera instead, using the zoom in an attempt to get a better look, although the image became grainy almost immediately. Even through the poor digital picture, the proportions looked no more human than they had through the glass, and Daniel briefly considered calling the police before asking himself what he could reasonably report when the figure had done nothing except stand on private land several hundred feet from the house. The exterior light timed out while Daniel was still watching, causing the garden and most of the field to disappear into darkness. He immediately touched the manual control beside the window and brought the light back on, only to realize that the figure was no longer standing at the far fence. It had moved perhaps halfway across the field without Daniel seeing it take a single step, and although he initially tried to convince himself that darkness had distorted his sense of distance, the figure was now close enough for the security light to reveal a faint, grey tone across its upper body. Molly moved closer to Daniel and began whining beneath her growl while the figure remained completely still in its new position. When the exterior light timed out for a second time, Daniel activated it almost immediately, but the figure had moved again and was now standing behind the near fence at the edge of his garden, less than 60 feet from the house. There was no possibility of misunderstanding the distance anymore, because Daniel knew exactly where the fence stood and had watched the creature cross most of the field without witnessing any movement whatsoever. He turned on every exterior light he could control from the bedroom, causing floodlights around the side garden, driveway, and rear of the house to create overlapping pools of brightness across the property. The figure remained at the fence, while Daniel watched without allowing himself to look away, and for several minutes, nothing about its posture changed. Its stillness was so complete that he began questioning whether it was alive at all, although the body was too unusual to resemble any object that could reasonably have appeared there by accident. From the closer distance, Daniel could make out pale grey skin across the upper body and an elongated head that looked subtly wrong without resembling any deformity he recognized. The eyes appeared unusually dark and disproportionately large, while the mouth seemed little more than a narrow line across the lower face. Daniel finally called the police and explained that an unknown person had entered the field behind his house and was behaving strangely, adding that the figure appeared exceptionally tall and might be attempting to approach the property. The operator asked whether Daniel was inside with the doors locked and confirmed that officers were being sent, although his rural location meant the nearest available unit could take some time to reach him. Daniel remained beside the window after ending the call because the creature had still not moved beneath the floodlights, and for the first time since waking, he began to believe that keeping it illuminated might actually be enough to prevent it from coming any closer. That hope disappeared when the figure slowly raised its head and directed its enormous dark eyes away from Daniel. At first, he thought it was looking towards the upper windows, but its attention had settled on the floodlight mounted above the garden. The creature then lifted one arm with a smooth and deliberate motion, revealing fingers far longer than Daniel expected, and although the hand could not physically reach the light from where it stood, the gesture made it obvious that the creature had identified the source of the illumination. The floodlight went out before Daniel could understand what had happened. He immediately hit the switch and tried again, but the garden remained dark, and the light refused to reactivate. The security lamp near the bedroom still worked, although it illuminated only the area closest to the house, and when Daniel directed his torch towards the garden, the fence where the creature had been standing was completely empty. Molly barked and backed away from the window, which was enough to convince Daniel that remaining upstairs was no longer sensible. He moved downstairs with the dog following so closely that her shoulder occasionally touched his leg, then checked every door and window despite knowing they had already been locked before he went to bed. Daniel switched on the interior lights throughout the ground floor and called the police again, explaining that the intruder was now somewhere inside the property boundary, although he deliberately avoided describing the figure as anything other than a person because he knew how unbelievable the rest would sound. The operator confirmed that officers were still approaching and instructed him not to leave the house, which was advice Daniel had no intention of ignoring. He remained in the kitchen with Molly and tried to monitor the rear garden without standing directly in front of the windows, while outside the security lights began activating around apparently empty sections of the property. One came on beside the garage without revealing anything, another illuminated the back gate several moments later, and eventually the light above the patio activated just as a tall grey shape passed the kitchen window. Daniel saw only part of the creature because it moved beyond the glass before he could turn fully, but its shoulder was almost level with the top of the exterior door frame. He stepped backwards and pulled Molly with him, and less than a second later, the patio light failed and plunged that side of the garden into darkness. Before Daniel could decide whether to move, something heavy crossed the roof above him with enough weight to make the ceiling timbers complain beneath it. Molly followed the sound from the kitchen into the hallway, staring upwards and growling while Daniel kept one hand on her collar. The movement travelled slowly from one side of the house to the other before stopping directly above the staircase, and several moments later a faint tapping sound came from an upstairs window. Daniel remained downstairs because he had already seen enough to know that investigating every sound would only place him closer to whatever was moving around the property. The silence that followed lasted long enough for him to wonder whether the creature had left the roof, but the handle on the rear door then began moving slowly downwards. Daniel watched from the hallway as it reached its lowest position and remained there for several seconds before returning carefully to its original place, making it clear that whatever was outside had deliberately tested the door rather than accidentally touching it. Daniel moved away from the kitchen and took Molly into the living room, where there were fewer windows and only one entrance from the hallway. He switched on a lamp, positioned himself where he could see the doorway, and kept the torch in his other hand while waiting for another sound. The house remained quiet until Molly abruptly turned towards the staircase and began growling again, forcing Daniel to direct the torch towards the upper landing. The hallway light downstairs remained on, but the bulb above the landing had gone out sometime during the previous few minutes, leaving the top of the staircase in darkness. Daniel quietly told Molly to come towards him, and she obeyed while continuing to stare upstairs. He had used almost exactly the same words earlier in the bedroom, although at the time there was no reason for him to consider that important. Several minutes later, Daniel heard his own voice coming from the dark landing above them, quietly telling Molly to come towards it. The imitation used his exact pitch and tone, yet the rhythm was subtly wrong, because the pause after Molly's name lasted slightly longer than Daniel would naturally leave it. Molly immediately pressed herself against his leg and growled towards the staircase rather than responding, and Daniel understood that whatever had been outside the house had not merely been watching him because it had also been listening closely enough to reproduce his voice. He backed towards the living room while keeping the torch aimed at the landing, but the voice did not repeat. A floorboard eventually bent beneath weight somewhere upstairs, followed by another sound farther along the landing, and Daniel realized that the creature had somehow entered the house without him hearing a window break or door open. He considered barricading himself inside the living room, but the lack of another exit made the room feel more like a trap than protection if the creature came downstairs. Daniel remembered that his car was parked beside the house and that the headlights could be activated remotely with the key fob. If he could create enough continuous illumination outside, he might be able to get Molly through the kitchen and into the yard before the creature reached the ground floor. So he collected the keys from a bowl near the living room door and encouraged Molly towards the hallway. The dog followed for only a few steps before stopping beside the open dining room doorway. Daniel had already walked past it and initially assumed Molly was still listening towards the staircase, but when he turned back, he realized that her attention was fixed entirely on the dark room beside them. He raised the torch and moved the beam across the table, chairs and far wall until the light reached the corner. The creature was standing upright against the wall, and Daniel understood immediately that he had passed within a few feet of it without noticing. Its head almost reached the ceiling, while its arms hung much lower than a human's, and the pale grey skin caught enough torchlight to reveal a body that was extremely thin without appearing weak. The enormous black eyes remained fixed on Daniel without blinking, and although he expected the creature to rush towards him once discovered, it remained completely motionless while the beam illuminated it. Daniel realized that the light was preventing it from advancing, so he kept the torch trained on the creature, while slowly retreating towards the kitchen. Molly remained beside him and produced a continuous growl, while the alien's eyes followed every movement with an attention that felt less like ordinary predatory focus and more like deliberate examination. Daniel eventually reached the kitchen doorway and pressed the key fob, causing the car headlights outside to flood part of the rear yard with bright light. He continued backing away while keeping the torch directed into the dining room, but the beam suddenly flickered as the battery connection failed for a fraction of a second. Daniel struck the side of the torch and restored the light almost immediately, yet the corner of the dining room was already empty. Before he could determine where the creature had gone, Molly barked behind him and forced Daniel to turn towards the kitchen. The alien was now standing at the opposite end of the room, having crossed more than 20 feet during the brief moment when the torch failed. From this distance, Daniel could finally see enough of the body to understand how profoundly wrong its proportions were, because it stood nearly 8 feet tall with long arms extending almost to the knees and an elongated head supported by a narrow neck. The face was smooth and pale, while the enormous black eyes reflected almost nothing from the kitchen light and remained focused entirely on Daniel. The creature began advancing with slow, controlled steps that made its intentions impossible to misunderstand, and Daniel retreated towards the rear door while repeatedly pressing the key fob to keep the car headlights active. There was no roar, sudden charge, or exaggerated display of aggression, because the alien simply continued reducing the distance between them with the same disturbing calm it had shown outside. Daniel reached the rear door and unlocked it while keeping Molly beside him, but the patio light failed as he pulled the door open and left half the garden in darkness. The creature immediately accelerated, forcing Daniel to push Molly outside before following her through the doorway. The dog hesitated for only a moment before moving with him into the brightest area created by the car headlights, while something struck the kitchen doorway behind them with enough force to make Daniel turn. The creature had reached the open rear door and stopped at the edge of the illuminated yard. Daniel kept the torch trained on it while backing towards the driveway, repeatedly activating the car lights whenever he feared they might time out. The alien raised one long arm and directed its attention towards the headlights, making Daniel realize that it was already attempting to understand the new source of illumination, just as it had studied the floodlight earlier. Before it could act, the sound of a vehicle engine became audible along the country road. Daniel shouted towards the approaching noise while continuing to hold the torch on the doorway, and moments later, headlights appeared beyond the hedge as a police car turned into the drive. The full beams swept across the house, garden and field at once, creating overlapping areas of light that forced Daniel to shield his eyes briefly. During that brief confusion, the creature disappeared from the doorway. Daniel could not tell whether it had moved towards the field, around the house, or into some darker section of the property, but the two officers immediately instructed him to bring Molly towards their vehicle while they searched the area with powerful torches. Daniel obeyed without taking his attention from the house, and within minutes the officers had checked every downstairs room before searching the upper floor, garden, and nearby outbuildings. They found no intruder, although the property contained physical evidence that Daniel could not explain away as exhaustion or panic. Mud-marked sections of the kitchen floor, despite Molly not having returned inside after entering the garden, while several extremely deep impressions in the soft ground beside the rear wall were too narrow and elongated to resemble normal footwear. The most disturbing evidence appeared beneath Daniel's bedroom window, where 5 long marks crossed the upper brickwork at a height nobody standing on the ground should have been able to reach. One of the officers photographed the marks repeatedly without attempting to explain them, and Daniel gave the same account several times while accepting that most people would probably assume he had misunderstood what happened. Police documented the damage, unusual impressions and marks around the property, but found no person, vehicle or equipment capable of explaining how an intruder could have reached the roof or second-floor window without being detected. Daniel cared less about whether anybody believed every part of the story than he expected, because he knew what he had seen inside the dining room and kitchen. Molly refused to sleep upstairs for nearly a month afterwards, and Daniel eventually stopped trying to make her because he had become equally uncomfortable in the bedroom. He used the downstairs spare room instead, while replacing several exterior lights and installing additional security cameras around the property. As the weeks passed without another incident, the field gradually became an ordinary part of the landscape again, and Daniel stopped checking every security light whenever it activated. He still avoided looking towards the far fence when waking during the night, but the constant expectation that something would be standing there slowly diminished, and he eventually began believing that whatever had visited the property had moved elsewhere. Several weeks after the incident, police returned copies of the security footage collected from Daniel's cameras. Most of the recordings were useless because they showed darkness, glare, or empty sections of the property immediately before the creature appeared somewhere else, and Daniel nearly deleted everything without reviewing it properly. One recording from the beginning of the night made him stop because it showed the rear of the house shortly after he first woke. The upstairs bedroom window was faintly illuminated behind the curtains, while far across the field, the tall figure stood exactly where Daniel remembered seeing it. He watched the recording for several seconds and almost moved to the next clip before noticing an unusual vertical shape against the wall of the house beneath his bedroom. Daniel paused the footage and enlarged the image, initially expecting the shape to resolve into a drainpipe or shadow cast by the security light. Instead, the outline became easier to recognize because it was extremely tall, unnaturally thin and completely motionless, with its elongated head tilted upwards towards Daniel's bedroom window. At the same moment, the other figure remained clearly visible at the distant edge of the field, meaning there was no possibility that one creature had somehow traveled between the two positions while the cameras failed to capture it. Daniel remained at the computer and watched the recording again from the beginning, remembering the shadow that had appeared across his bedroom curtains before he ever noticed the figure in the field. For weeks, he had assumed that the creature outside his window had somehow crossed the property and returned to the distant fence before he looked outside, but the security footage finally showed him what had actually happened. While Daniel had been staring across the field at one creature, another had already been standing directly beneath his bedroom window, and whatever had happened during the rest of that night had begun with two of them outside the house from the very beginning.